Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of KPCC and LAist, welcome to our No Panic Guide Live virtual event series. I'm John Cohen. I manage live programming and events for KPCC and LAist. This series is an extension of the more comprehensive Your No Panic Guide resource from our newsroom, which you can find at laist.com. Today's edition is focused on navigating rental life and the moratorium on evictions from Governor Gavin Newsom. And there are more events to come. You can sign up for our weekly events newsletter and follow us on social media for updates. If you're in a position in which you can support KPCC and LAist, we're always grateful for anything you can do. Links to all these points of connection are in the comments section. And without further ado, here's KPCC and LAist investigative reporter, Aaron Mendelson.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to everyone tuning in today. Like John said, my name is Aaron Mendelssohn. I'm a reporter for KPCC Southern California Public Radio and also for our digital arm, laist.com. And recently I've been focusing on low-income housing during a global pandemic, reporting on rental housing right here in Southern California. And just in the last few weeks, month and a half or so, evictions have emerged as just a really, really crucial and important matter of public concern, not just a matter of housing, as they always were, and people's finances and an economic issue, but also as an issue of public health. We've heard our leaders talk a lot about evictions in recent weeks, and people like Gavin Newsom have said they're a public health issue. If people are getting kicked out of their homes at this point, that's going to contribute to the spread of the virus. So that's part of the reason why it's become such a big issue. Also, of course, we've seen skyrocketing unemployment. Folks aren't going to be able to pay rent, and so this issue could not be more important right now. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the coverage that I have been doing recently. We were collecting letters from landlords to tenants in advance of the first of the month in April. This was going to be the first month really here in the Los Angeles area after we had gone on lockdown and into our safer at home precautions, and a lot of folks were out of work. We wanted to see what kind of communications people were hearing from their landlords. And we saw a number of letters where landlords were expressing concern, telling tenants how they could pay rent without going into an office, how they can do things like sanitize door handles. By far the most common thing we saw in these letters was landlords reminding their tenants the rent is still due, which it is. All sorts of other messages saying things like shared facilities are shut down, non-emergency maintenance is on hold. I saw an email from one tenant that said her landlord was offering a $50 gift card for paying rent on time. One letter in particular that I reported on drew a lot of attention. We saw just a ton of people reading this and commenting on this LAist post. It was a letter from landlord Rom Residential in Los Angeles, which told tenants that if they were on a deferral plan, so if they weren't able to pay rent and they agreed to some sort of plan to pay back rent, that they would have to turn over 100% of any government stimulus money they got within 5 days of receiving it. That's what the letter said. There's nothing in the law that says that would have to be the case. And LA City Councilman David Rue saw this letter. He got furious. He wrote a letter to this company saying that their attempt to extract the meager support working Angelenos might receive right now is shameful. Rom Residential, for their part, said it was all a misunderstanding. That letter was a draft, and it's been revised since to take out the language about stimulus money. In a phone interview, I talked to a partner from Rom Residential who told me that about a third of their renters weren't able to pay rent at the beginning of the month. This month, they control about 1,500 units. So that gives you an idea of just what a struggle it is to pay rent for people in town right now. So one other story I wanted to mention was about a woman named Presley Wilson. She's a single mother who lives in a mobile home park in Pomona, a place called California Trailer Grove on Foothill Boulevard. She got in mid-March a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. This is a step in the eviction process, and this notice arrived at her door. Told her about the hold that she was in. She owed $625 for back rent, along with another $130 some for electricity, water, sewer, and trash bills. She hadn't been able to pay her rent in March because she wasn't able to work. Her main gig is driving Lyft. And as a chronically ill person, she had decided to stop driving Lyft because she didn't want to get infected with the virus. Normally in these situations, she would reach out to a county office and make use of a program called Emergency Assistance to Prevent Eviction. But with county offices closed, she was struggling to reach county workers. And so she found herself self-isolating in her trailer, facing eviction during a pandemic as a chronically ill person. I'm happy to tell you that we published this story and we had readers reach out and offer to help Presley and her son with their rent. A reader actually sent masks to Presley and her 4-year-old son, which is really amazing. But obviously that's not an option that most tenants are going to be able to have if they're not able to make a payment. So one thing we're going to talk about today is the really quickly changing situation that we've seen, the kind of shifting legal landscape around rent and evictions, particularly evictions here in the state of California. So since that's going to be such a focus, I prepared a little bit of a visual aid that I wanted to share with you guys. So you'll have to bear with my not perfect handwriting, but I think this is not comprehensive, but I think it'll give you an idea of just how quickly things have been moving. So less than a month ago, on March 15th, Mayor Eric Garcetti of Los Angeles issued an order saying that no one in the city of LA could be evicted, no residential tenant, for COVID-19 related reasons. So if you lost your job because of COVID, can't be evicted. It's on the 15th. The next day, on the 16th, Governor Gavin Newsom issues an order that lets cities and counties across the state of California halt evictions in their boundaries. The order didn't actually implement anything anywhere, but it allowed cities and counties to do that. This caused a lot of confusion, led folks to think that there was an eviction moratorium in place across the state when there wasn't. But that was a big step. So first two steps, 15th and 16th of March, literally the next day, the LA Superior Court, the county court system here in Los Angeles County, the most populous county in the United States of America, says, hey, we're going to be closed for most functions through April 16th. No eviction trials are going to be moving forward in that time. So that put the brakes on any eviction that was in the pipelines at that point. Very next week, March 23rd, we hear from the LA Superior Court again. Presiding Judge Kim Brazil writes another letter saying that actually we're not just going to stay closed for most functions through mid-April. We're going to stay closed until June 22nd. And so evictions are paused until that time. March 23rd, same day, Mayor Eric Garcetti comes back, updates his order, or issues a new order rather, halting other kinds of evictions here in the city of LA, halting what's known as Ellis Act evictions and also no-fault evictions. A little bit later, we hear from Governor Gavin Newsom again. He says he issues what he calls an eviction moratorium across the state of California. Many tenant advocates didn't like that phrasing, but what it did is said landlords couldn't kick out any tenant for COVID-19 related reasons if they weren't able to pay for losing their job for coronavirus related reasons. That can no longer happen across the state. And then just this week, our seventh flashcard here, the Judicial Council, a body that oversees courts here in the state of California, they say no summons and no judgments in eviction trials or in eviction cases. These are important milestones in eviction cases, and if they're not happening, that means people aren't going to be their eviction cases aren't going to be moving forward unless there's a pressing public safety concern. So that's a lot to take in. It's a lot to process. It's okay if you didn't understand the whole thing because it's a really confusing situation. So joining me to break all this down and help answer your questions is Javier Beltran. Javier, if you don't mind introducing yourself and telling folks about your background.
Hey, good afternoon, Aaron. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. My background, I've been working in nonprofit now for nonprofit legal service providers for 12 years. I started with suing slum landlords and slum housing litigation, And then I started working on homeless prevention and eviction defense work as part of the response to the stimulus package back in 2018. And then from there continued on with other eviction defense programs. I currently am a managing attorney for the program for the Preventing and Ending Homelessness program here for the County of Los Angeles. And so, and our emphasis is really making sure people don't get homeless in the first place.
And the world is changing so fast right now. The world looks so different than it did just a month ago. You know, how are tenants navigating this this new reality in this landscape that is shifting just by the day at this point?
It's difficult because they're not able to go and actually visit a lot of the legal service providers or a lot of the community-based organizations, right? So these are the ones that would provide the information, and people would walk in or ask questions. And now they're really getting a lot of their information from the news. And so for example, they'll hear the eviction moratorium and they'll think that there are no longer any evictions happening within the city of LA or the county or the state or even through the federal government. And they hear this word all the time. And it's difficult to understand the nuance and the complications to that, because all these laws are not preventing evictions from moving forward. Some of them provide for defenses as an affirmative defense to an eviction lawsuit, or they provide delaying of an eviction lawsuit for a certain time. So they're not necessarily preventing evictions from happening in the first place. The last slide, or the last paper that you had regarding judicial counsel, that does stop eviction filings from happening because the summons won't be issued. And so, and I feel like not many people, the landlords will know that, but tenants will know that. So we're doing as much as we can along the legal services side, and I know community-based organizations, they're doing their part as well and trying to get the information out there as well, and for people to know what they can and cannot do, and especially for tenants who they know they're going to be behind in rent, and they know they're kind of desperate on what to do because they feel they may get kicked out. And just be rest assured that, I mean, the landlords cannot forcibly evict a tenant unless they have a judicial or court order to do so. And right now, unless it's some sort of health and safety reason, they're not going to be able to file an eviction, and they won't be able to get an eviction entered against a tenant unless for that's very specific reason.
So all this stuff that we've been hearing about, it's designed to keep people in their homes, at least for now. But it doesn't mean that people don't have to pay that rent back eventually.
Yeah, that's correct. So none of these, the local, the county, and then the state nor the federal waive any rent. What it does, it provides folks some time to pay the rent at a later date, right? So for example, there are 29 local ordinances at this time as we speak, and there may be more by the end of today or the end of this week, that are providing certain periods of time when they could pay it back, right? So for example, LA City has a period of 1 year that you could pay back your rent. And there's others that have a whole 6 months, or if, for example, Southgate only has a period that's undetermined, and then a judge will have to determine that time in which to pay back their rent. So there are different rules pertaining to where people live, in regards to paying back the rent, but it is not waived in any way.
And some of the letters that I was reviewing that tenants had got and asked for really specific information from people, things like their bank statements or the contact information of their supervisors at work. Are those things required by these laws? If your landlord asks for things like that, do you need to turn it over?
None of these laws, none of these changes, none of these ordinances require any kind of requirement for a contract or some sort of agreement, a written agreement between the landlord and the tenant and stuff. And I would not provide any private information to another third party, because it could lead to misinformation, and it could be misuse of that information. So I would not do that, and I would not advise anybody to do that. And like I mentioned, the ordinances do not require them to enter into an agreement at any time, because the ordinances do allow for a certain time period. And so as long as they pay within that time period, it could be, if it's a year from now, it could be on day 363 they pay, and as long as they pay, then that's allowed through the ordinance. And I wouldn't do it also just because if you're contracting with a landlord, it may either cut you off from what is like statutory your period of time to pay, which is maybe greater, and in the contract it may be shorter, and then it may be cutting off on different rights as well that you have. So I wouldn't sign any of those contracts.
And the payment period, the repayment period, I should say, changes depending on where you live.
That's correct.
That'll be something we're tracking, and that is likely, I think, frankly, to change as we move into the days and weeks ahead. I want to get into some of our audience questions in a moment, but one more question I had for you, Javier, is in talking about these issues, we hear a lot about mom and pop landlords. Do you have any sense of here in Los Angeles and the Southern California area, how many landlords are mom and pops versus some of these bigger corporate entities that we've seen become more common in recent years?
So as in the theory, the theory that I have, and from my understanding of what is out there in regards to the landlords that we see on a day-to-day basis and the evictions that are filed, my guess is that they're a very small population of the overall landlords that have apartment buildings or have owned buildings in LA County. They are a vocal, I would say, a minority, but it's also politically the larger groups of landlords, which are corporations and umbrella corporations and these other multi-shadow corporations, as you know. I think they use the mom and pop concept and the ideal of the mom and pop as a political ploy in order to get a lot of more landlord friendly rules and regulations in place. And so because they don't want because by helping the mom and pop, you're helping the overall landlord population in regards to less rights for tenants and greater rights for landlords in that case.
And large property management and landlord companies are something I know a little bit about. If folks haven't seen it, I would encourage them to check out a story I published on our website, LAS, earlier this year about a company called Palma Management, a really enormous landlord here in Southern California, all the way from LA to San Bernardino to Bakersfield. They control more than $1 billion in property and many, many thousands of apartment units and mobile home park units. And of interest to this conversation, they have a really systematized process for evicting tenants and have evicted thousands of households over the last decade.
One thing to add to that, Aaron, if you don't mind, post 2008, after the Great Recession, a lot of mom and pop landlords lost their homes due to foreclosure. And so what ended up happening after that was banks actually ended up buying up these properties, and then corporations were the ones stepping in and buying a lot of these wide chunks of blocks of properties throughout LA County and throughout different counties in San Bernardino and Riverside County. And so what you end up having is like corporations like Blackstone, for example, that own huge swaths of properties throughout LA County and throughout Southern California. And so these are the folks that are the ones that have large portfolios of properties and are the majority owners in LA County and throughout Southern California.
Right, and we've seen the rate of home ownership go down in California in recent years, especially since the Great Recession. And so renting has definitely been on the rise. So getting to some of the audience questions, and you can still comment and Facebook and tweet your questions at us now. We got a question from Ryan Thomas. Ryan said, so to understand, court is closed until at least June 22nd. So regardless of the moratorium or not, no eviction for any reason can proceed until at least June 22nd. Is that correct, Javier?
No. So my understanding is that with the new judicial council order that was promulgated and created on April 6th, that basically that no new evictions will be issued. A summons for an eviction lawsuit won't be issued until 90 days after the governor removes the stay-at-home emergency order. So that you're looking at, assuming it's in May, let's just say it's in June 1st, just for as an example, you're looking into September probably until they could actually file an eviction at that point. So I know there was previous orders from the LA Superior Court and presiding Judge Brazil, which kind of conflicts with this, but this one supersedes all of those beforehand, just because of the fact that Judicial Council is the overseeing body of all the California state courts. So they're the ones that are overseeing and supervising all the courts. So they have the authority to do that.
The Judicial Council also carved out an exception for public safety reasons, right?
Yes. We don't know exactly how that it would entail and what they would have to do. My guess is they would have to file some kind of civil action in order to then try to get an eviction filed in order to do that. So it's a more complicated way of getting through an eviction. So don't know the specifics on that because the Judicial Council did not lay out the specific rules on how to do that, but did lay out that exception.
Yeah, but I think it's safe to assume that would be a very small number of these cases. So we got a question from Adriana who asked, what happens if a tenant doesn't pay the April and May rent since they're laid off? If that tenant moves out before they repay the rent, what resources do landlords have to recover rent?
So legally, I guess they would still have that debt, right? So, and then since they're no longer in possession and leave before paying that debt, the landlord may be, and if they want to, file, depending on the amount, of small claims lawsuit against the tenant in order to have a money judgment against that tenant for that amount owed. Now, practically speaking, there's a lot of landlords aren't going to have any way to collect that just because probably they don't know where that tenant's going to move to. They don't know where to serve that tenant. And so a lot of those legal mechanisms may not be available in order to collect. And I just think a lot of landlords just move on in order to re-rent that apartment or that unit as quickly as possible.
And so from the tenant point of view, if you're not able to pay and you move out before paying your back rent, legally you still owe that money.
Yes, that is still legally an obligation that you have, and then, like I said, if the landlord would want to collect on that, they could seek on collections for that.
Great. So we have another question from Chris Kissel, who asks, what can a tenant do if their landlord is trying to access their apartment for renovations and other work during the crisis? Tenants may feel uncomfortable giving anyone access in their homes, including their landlord, because of concern about the virus.
So this is interesting. So I think first and foremost, I think for health and safety reasons, there has to be social distancing, and depending on how extensive the rehab is, I think that's something that the landlord and the tenant would probably have to talk about, because if they're exposing themselves to respiratory issues because if they're opening a wall or doing something that would inhibit that kind of condition, I wouldn't advise for it. And I think it would be an issue that they would, I mean, if I was the tenant myself, I would have a serious discussion with the landlord and saying, hey, because of the issue with COVID-19 and it's in relation to respiratory problems, if you're thinking about knocking down walls and doors and putting in windows, then that's going to put us at greater health risk. And especially if there's multiple workers and contractors that are within that unit, then it's something that I think you would have to talk to the landlord in order to try to negotiate something, maybe perhaps post COVID-19 stay-at-home orders, because I think it's inconvenient and it's almost negligent in a way if a landlord wants to do that now, just because of the situation that we're in right now. It wouldn't make any sense. And the only reason the only way it makes sense is if maybe the landlord's trying to harass these folks to get out in order to get other people in.
So non-essential work really shouldn't be happening.
I mean, unless it's something for health and safety, if it's like fixing the roof, if it's leaking and things of that nature, then yes, because I think those are the kind of repairs that need to be done in order to maintain the unit as habitable and maintain as a livable dwelling. But aside from that, no.
We've got another question, this one about commercial tenants. The person asking the question wanted to know if they were affected or protected at all by Governor Newsom's actions.
So from my understanding, and that's a good question, because I know a lot of the laws apply for commercial and residential tenants equally. And so some of these protections would be applied for commercial tenancies as well, knowing the situation is not just with residential tenants losing their income and their work income, it's also the commercial tenancies that are losing the income from people who actually are shopping and buying their items within the stores or wherever they're selling them. So a lot of these ordinances do include commercial, and I have to double check with the state, but I believe that the commercial tenancies are involved in this as well.
And it seems like the Judicial Council's actions this week would prevent the immediate sort of eviction of commercial tenants.
Yeah, so the way commercial tenancies work, they're also as part of the residential tenancies, and in the sense that they're in the same legal process that as residential. So you still have to file an eviction, and in this situation you can't file an eviction because you can't obtain the summons, and so then hence they can't move forward with an eviction process in the same way residential tenancies are treated under the Judicial Council order.
And another question from our audience, some of these are anonymous, some folks don't want to share their name. This question asker said, we're staying in a hotel temporarily. Can a hotel in LA County kick us out if we get sick, even if we are able to pay for the room?
So my understanding is this, so depending on the arrangement that you have with the hotel itself, so, and it also depends on how much time you have, right? So if you're staying there and your arrangement is to stay there for 5 days, and that's what you paid for initially, and that's what you initially paid for, then the obligation is to stay for there for the 5 days. However, if you are continuously paying for that room and you stay beyond the 30 days, which then at that point it creates a month-to-month tenancy, which then in that case you become a renter, even though it is considered a hotel. So with that situation, then if they want to remove them, they would have to do an eviction, and they have to file an eviction, which again they cannot do because the fact that the court is prohibiting the issuance of the summons for those evictions.
Got it. And one thing I wanted to ask about, so right now, we're in this period of safer at home, we're all staying at home, and there are these freezes and protections. But Javier, are you worried about what happens when normal life returns and some of these orders lift? What happens when these temporary changes to evictions are gone?
Yes, I'm worried for then, and I'm actually worried even now, to the extent that I think between the period of now and then, landlords are going to get desperate. And I think as the months go on, where tenants are not going to be able to pay their rent or pay only a portion of their rent, landlords are going to get desperate in regards to trying to remove tenants forcefully, which legally they cannot do. And so to me, I think that is a big concern, just because without any legal remedy, I think landlords are going to be forced to do through other means, are trying to evict folks as well. Now, on the other end, in regards to once these orders are lifted, absolutely. I mean, they call it a tsunami. I call it an avalanche. It is folks that are going to have 3-day notices. They're going to have summons and complaints, and these are going to be folks who are going to haven't been paying their rent for a period of time, and so they're going to seek legal help. And as of right now, there just isn't sufficient legal help, at least for low-income individuals and families, to do that. And so our concern is trying to do a lot of the work on the front end in order to try to minimize that as much as possible, because we're trying to educate folks on what to do beforehand and in regards to their rent, and if they can pay their rent, they should, or if they cannot, at least give notices to their landlord that they're unable to pay rent due to the COVID-19 reasons, right? And so, because a lot of these jurisdictions are stating that if you have a COVID-related reason for not paying your rent, then that could be an affirmative defense, which helps eviction attorneys with their cases, and it could be and we could easily try to keep them in, compared to someone who just has not given any notices and has done anything up to the point of when the stay orders are lifted and everything, and then the landlords could file complaints. And then at that point, it would be more difficult to help tenants that way.
So we also got a number of submissions about mortgages. Obviously, if you're a residential tenant, a mortgage is not something that you're paying. But I wondered if you would be able to talk a little bit. Are you familiar with some of the changes and actions that have happened around mortgages?
I'm not too familiar because that would be home ownership, and so I'm not very familiar with it. I mean, the only thing that I'll say is this: is that under the stimulus package, under the there are certain funds available to landlords under SBA loans that they could apply to in order to help them out for the due to the loss of income, which is here is loss of rent coming in. So that's available. I know banks on a national level have deferred mortgage payments up to 3 months because of the fact that folks cannot make their mortgage payments. And so there are certain protections, and I know at least statewide there's been some protections regarding foreclosure as well. So helping landlords who are facing foreclosure in order to get assistance as well.
Got it. And I wanted to ask a question kind of from the homeowner point of view. So, your background is making sure that the tenants know their rights and are able to assert their rights. I've, in my reporting, also talked to groups like the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles and heard things from them like, well, landlords are kind of kneecapped by these regulations. Eviction is a very important tool for property owners, and this just removes any incentive for tenants to pay rent, and now bad tenants just won't pay rent. So I wanted to see what you had to say from that line that I've heard from the property owner side of things.
Yeah, and so I look at it this way. I mean, if the landlord thinks they're kneecapped, then you're pretty much taking out the lower body of a tenant at that point because they're going to be severely uh, incapacitated in regards to their ability to be housed. Because if they're not able to stay at what they're staying at, they're going to be homeless, and then that's going to cause a bigger health crisis because if you're having all these individuals and families out there without homes. So I understand in the point of view of the landlords that they are not collecting rent and maybe perpetuating some sort of behavior that will lead to folks not paying the rent. But if you talk to folks, at least and I think you mentioned it earlier before, there's still about 70-80% of folks still paying rent, right? And people who pay will who want to pay who are paying rent will pay the rent, and so or at least portion of it, because at the end of the day, they know that at the end of this, if they're gonna owe that money. It's gonna be almost like a credit card line of credit that you're not going to be able to pay, right? And they're going to be facing eviction. So folks who have that money will be able to at least pay a portion or pay their rent. And it's not that that they're just going to become all of a sudden bad tenants. It's a very small group of folks that are fit under that criteria. And I think it's just like kind of the misconception that a small group is what defines all the tenants, right? So I think in that sense, I think it's over exaggerated in a way. But as I said, I do understand the landlord's point of view in the sense that they are struggling as well. And this is a domino, right? Tenant can't pay the rent, landlord can't pay their mortgage, then they're going to fall into foreclosure, and then so on and so on, and they'll lose their property. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's more landlords generally have more resources than tenants do, and that's the reality that that's an everyday reality, and it's more so during this time.
Another question we got from the audience is about parking fees. So the question is, my management company has a separate parking fee not included in rent, imposed per unit. They have raised it in exorbitant fashion in order for long-term rent control renters to pay as much as new renters. What can I do?
So if that is a fee, you cannot be evicted based on a fee. So again, I mean, and this is to me where I think you're gonna have to think about like what is your importance in regards to the now rather than thinking a little bit more forward. But to me, like, so first, parking fees are not considered rent, right? It's not part of the rent, it's a separate charge altogether, so they can't be evicted by that. And also, I mean, if you're thinking about paying your parking fee and buying food or any other kind of resource, I would say stick with that rather than paying that parking fee, because that parking fee is not going to be is as important. And then also some local ordinances have put a freeze on on late fees as well, which are included with that. And so there are some depending on the jurisdictions, they have added some protections to that.
The city of LA, I believe, is one that is frozen late fees, which means even if you pay your rent late and your landlord would normally impose a fee for paying late, that is suspended right now. We got another question about the city of LA, and just as a little background before I ask it, I'll mention that the RSO is the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. It covers buildings before, gosh, it's the late 70s, forget the exact year, apartment units built before then, have rent control in the city of LA. And currently, I believe that during this emergency, the mayor has stopped all rent increases in RSO units. So the question we got from our audience is, how many rental units are in LA and what percentage are covered by RSO laws?
Good question. I mean, I can't give you an exact, it's hundreds and thousands of units throughout the city of LA. And also you have to keep in mind that another probably 100,000 or more have been added based on the Tenant Protection Act that was enacted this year as part of the state that would fall under those protections as well. So my guess, and I always forget the exact number, but it's definitely over at least I think 400,000, 500,000 units. It's probably more than that. Throughout the city of LA. And you got to remember, city of LA goes from San Pedro all the way up to San Fernando, all the way down to Eagle Rock. So it's a huge city. So many of units. And so they would be, I mean, and then also, like I said, as part of the Tenant Protection Act, it allowed for more units to be covered under rent control that were not covered before as part of the RSO. And so that is had additional units to be included with that.
And just this week in City Council, two council members, Mike Bonin and David Rue, had introduced a motion to freeze rents for all rental units in LA. We don't know if that will pass, but that is new. And then Council President Mary Martinez introduced a measure that would help renters who aren't able to pay make up some of the gap. Modeling it after a program that already existed, because they hope to get that up and running very fast. So we have another question from someone listening in. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Hoy Deep asks, in the long term, would this cause landlords to sell their properties, and therefore would this cause drop of rental properties on the market? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think so. I mean, there was a housing crisis before COVID-19. I think there's going to be even a greater housing crisis afterwards. And so I think the demand is out there. Folks can't have, there's not enough affordable housing out in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. And so the fact that I think there's going to be less housing available, that is a reality. I mean, and that's going to be a continuous reality in the sense that folks are just, the folks who are working and living and working in LA generally cannot afford it. And so then you're having a situation where you're having a growing homelessness population because of that reality.
Interesting. And of course, we don't know how the current moment is going to change the housing market in LA, but we do know that the last crisis led to less home ownership and more renters. And here in LA County, I know there was the question about how many RSO units are in the city. The county is bigger than the city, has 10 million people. I know there's some a little north of 3 million units of housing in the county of Los Angeles, and that the majority of those are occupied by renters. So most households in the county of LA, renters live in them, and that's actually not true for most of the state of California. It's just LA and San Francisco that are at such a high degree of renters.
Because they're huge urban areas that have been expanding out, and then people have just been gravitating to the urban areas, especially in LA and San Francisco. So that makes sense. And then just one thing to clarify though, in regards to, you mentioned the LA County. So LA County did pass a protection for I put quote unquote eviction moratoriums, but eviction protections for unincorporated areas of LA County. And I think people get this confused with the entire county, and the authority of the county, and they're looking into that now in the sense of whether LA County and the Board of Supervisors could pass eviction preventions for the entire county and all 88 cities, right? So then that way there could be a uniform eviction protection rules for all cities throughout LA County. And that is something that I think they're going to report back, I think this week. But the idea is then that would be the case. But for currently though, the protections that the LA County has implemented has only been for unincorporated areas of LA County. And I think people, and so that's their misconception. I hear people's like, oh, LA County's already got protections. I'm like, it's a smaller group of areas that are not incorporated with any cities, right? So there's areas that are like Willowbrook is one example, Athens is another, in South LA, and then large parts of Antelope Valley are unincorporated to Lancaster and Palmdale, which are actual cities. But so these are places that would fit under the unincorporated eviction protections.
Right. And that just kind of further complicates things because there's just so many different cities here in Southern California. I want to wrap up, but let me ask you one more question before we go here. So if someone gets an eviction notice on their door, what should their first step be?
So one of the things, I guess it depends on when they got the eviction, right? So they shouldn't be getting an eviction going forward, but I'll talk about that situation if that does happen because of the judicial council order. But that's one situation. The other situation is before April 6th, they were still issuing summons and eviction lawsuits, so then people could have been served by that. We have a couple of clients of our own that have been served on during the weekend before that were served an eviction complaint with a summons and a complaint. And so with those folks, we're advising them that they still need to answer that unlawful detainer eviction lawsuit. And they have up till April 23rd. They could start filing an answer as of early as April 17th, because that is when, based on the court order, that they can start filing an answer at that point, and then have it up to the 23rd is just their final day to answer. So for those folks who do have one, make sure you, during that time period, you file an answer, seek legal help, legal services in order to help you file an answer, because if not, then they can't enter defaults. But guess what? Once that day one starts, when they can enter default, they will enter defaults, and they'll have a whole huge list of fines that they're waiting for. Now, for folks who do get complaints served on them post April 6th, so it depends, I guess, when they received, I guess, when the landlord actually received the summons and complaint, because it could have been before April 6th, right? So they could have filed it before April 6th and they served it at some time after April 6th. That's plausible. But if they do, one, I think they just seek legal help with a legal service provider, to somebody that, an attorney. But also, if it doesn't have a summons, right, and I don't have an actual copy of a summons of what that looks like, and if it's just the complaint, then that is not a valid lawsuit, right? That is something that you're not obligated to answer, and you shouldn't answer, because if you do, then you put yourself in the jurisdiction of the court, and then they could proceed once they open up the courts against you on that eviction. So we recommend, if they have a summons, seek legal help right away, and in order to get you assistance on how to answer that. If it doesn't, then it's just it's a mechanism that the landlord's using to probably harass or trying to scare folks in order to either move out or try to answer, even though they don't have the proper paperwork with them.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Javier Beltran of the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. Really great to have your insights. And thank you, everyone, watching. This is a version of the No Panic Guide. On las.com, you'll find all sorts of coverage of what's going on with coronavirus and frankly, other things in Los Angeles. Other things still are happening. Including our very popular No Panic Guide to how to handle the pandemic. You can also listen to KPCC at 89.3 FM. And if you have questions about evictions or have heard from your landlord or our landlord who has a story you want to tell, you can find me online. I'm on Twitter at @Mendelssohn. Again, want to thank everyone who helped put this together, Javier and KPCC's in-person team, and thank you for watching.
Thanks, Eric.